We all know them. The illustrations in our history books showing us legions of ancient Egyptian laborers constructing the monumental pyramids with nothing but ropes, ramps, and sheer muscle power. But what if this widespread notion is simply wrong? What if the pharaohs didn't just have simple tools like hammers and chisels, but a lost, advanced technology that we wouldn't even dare to dream of today? Well, then we would have arrived at the heart of the heated debate that has been going on in the alternative scene for several decades now. But what evidence is there that the ancient Egyptians were in fact far more advanced than is commonly assumed? And could it really be that this knowledge is deliberately hidden from us? How much does a single family home weigh? A quick Google search shows that the home sweet home weighs an average of 250 to 300 tons, or the equivalent of around 3.6 to 4.3 rosy granite blocks. After all, there is one thing we must not forget. When the ancient Egyptians built the so-called King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, they had to maneuver colossal blocks of rose granite weighing up to 70 tons each to dizzying heights. The question of how the inhabitants of ancient times managed to move such extreme loads without the help of modern machines, and then to fit them perfectly, is still one of the most controversial historical puzzles of our time. What is undisputed, however, is that the architectural megalomania of the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire knew no bounds. After all, the Great Pyramid, which consists of around 2.65 million stone blocks, was the tallest structure in the world for almost 4,000 years. But, if you like, the historical mystery begins even before the ancient construction site. The material, which weighed tons, actually had to be dragged from quarries up to 800 kilometers from the Giza Plateau. And yet, despite the gigantic blocks and the lack of pyramid construction records, the Egyptians somehow managed to build a 147-meter-high giant out of the ground, which, in addition to its monumental dimensions, also boasts an almost ridiculously high level of precision. You may have heard that the blocks of the pyramids fit together so perfectly that not even a sheet of paper would fit between them, that their sides are aligned exactly with the 4 cardinal points, and that the difference in the lengths of the sides is not even 1/1000th of a meter. And although the Pyramid of Cheops is undoubtedly the most famous stone testimony to the Egyptians and is still overshadowed by huge questions, it is by no means the only one. Just take a look at the Valley Temple of the King Shepharon, located near the Great Sphinx. Many of the rose granite blocks at this site weigh more than 30 tons. Nevertheless, the massive individual parts were put together so perfectly that they look like an oversized puzzle. In front of the impressive blocks, even adults look like puny kids. And once again, the material used came not from a quarry around the corner, but from several hundred kilometers away. Does this mishap prove the existence of a lost technology? When it comes to the question of how the ancient Egyptians moved their enormous loads from A to B, conservative historians usually point to ships. This is an understandable approach, but it does have a small archaeological catch. Even the largest Egyptian ships that have been awakened from their historical slumber so far would never have been able to withstand such immense weights. What the current historiography also cannot withstand is the hypothesis that the Egyptians by no means used hammers and soft copper chisels to process their stone blocks, but a futuristic laser cutting technology. And in fact, the proof of this wacky thesis is said to be visible for everyone in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Specifically, this refers to a block adorned with a strangely oblique cut, and which is consequently a stone that was damaged and could no longer be used. However, the length of the cut can quickly make you wonder, why would the ancient stonemason have continued working for hours or even days if the block was no longer usable? Historians generally assume that the inhabitants of the Pharaonic kingdom used a combination of copper saws and a mixture of water, plaster, and quartz sand to cut the stone. And indeed, the presumed construction techniques were to be subjected to a few modern practical tests, and the results were quite sobering. In one of these cases, 2 men were struggling with a simple saw on a typical block of stone, and managed to penetrate just 4 millimeters into the material in an hour. So how long would the Egyptians have had to keep sawing before they realized they had made the cut on the museum block? For many an alternative-minded person, the displayed mishap testifies to nothing more than the solid proof that something may be wrong with our current ideas. In other words, the techniques of the Egyptians were never as simple as officially taught. On the contrary, they had exceptionally effective technologies that allowed them to work with the massive components at will and at lightning speed. Ancient Egyptian helicopters and battle tanks. It is said that the ancient Egyptians themselves immortalized their extraordinary technological achievements for posterity, but unfortunately we have forgotten how to interpret the records of the past correctly. Among the most famous motifs that are said to attest to this controversial fact are the so-called bulbs of Dendera. And while the corresponding reliefs adorn the eponymous Temple of Hathor at Dendera, they divide the public into two camps. The conservative researchers say that here we see only the Egyptian creation myth. The alternative side, however, does not recognize the bubble-shaped containers as the womb of the sky goddess Nut, but as fully functional electric lamps. The matter is no less controversial in the case of the enigmatic hieroglyphics that catch our eye in the mortuary temple of Sethoth I in Abydos. After all, we see here extremely strange shapes that resemble airplanes and helicopters. But how is that possible? How could the ancient Egyptians even know what such technologies look like or how they work? But that's not all. A battle tank and a submarine are also said to have crept into the Abydos hieroglyphics. Well, at least that's the conclusion reached by the Ancient Astronaut Society group, which discovered the symbols in the middle of the so-called Appearance Hall in the 1990s. The team interpreted the images as incontrovertible proof of the pre-astronaut theory. That is, the assumption that the Egyptians were in regular contact with extraterrestrial intelligences. While they were worshipped as divine beings from then on, they revealed advanced knowledge to the inhabitants of the earth in return, which made the construction of the pyramids and the like possible in the first place. But it is not really surprising that the long-established Egyptologists interpret the Abydos hieroglyphics a little differently. According to them, the inscription originally mentioned the so-called Nebti and throne names of Pharaoh Sethi I. The translation was as follows: the Nebti name, born again with a mighty sword, he who destroys the 9 bows, and the throne name, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the 2 lands, the world order of Re is enduring. Later, parts of the inscription were covered with plaster and replaced with the names of Ramses II. However, as the bright colors faded over time and the plaster crumbled from the stone, the older hieroglyphs reappeared. So what looks like a modern helicopter is actually a combination of the original sign for a bow and the later hieroglyphics for striking arm, quail chick, and arm. The supposed battle tank comes from the hieroglyphic mixture of hand and half. The submarine is actually a mixture of arm and basket. On the trail of lost technologies. But then, of course, there is also the legend of the Hall of Records. Under the Sphinx's paws is said to be a secret door leading straight to an ancient library that testifies to the existence of a long-forgotten pre-Egyptian civilization. The fact that the Sphinx is significantly older than generally assumed is supposedly shown by conspicuous water erosion marks that simply do not match the climate records of the last 5,000 years. To explain these, and also to obtain a suitable match with the belt stars of Orion, one would have to turn back the wheel of time as far as 10,500 BC. The pyramids, which were added later, are therefore architectural additions. They were aligned to coincide with the buildings from the so-called mythical time of the beginning. The ominous precursor culture that created the Sphinx is therefore said to have had a direct influence on the ancient Egyptians. And the technological masterpieces that arose from this traditional knowledge are said to have paved the way for the construction of the monumental buildings in the first place. But even if we simply embrace the idea that the ancient Egyptians had exotic technologies at their disposal, the question arises as to what these actually looked like in detail. Well, even the skeptical alternative camp is not in agreement on this point, but there is at least a consensus that they worked quite differently than our modern machines. For this reason, archaeologists would all be too happy to overlook them, because they are looking for something that resembles our inventions and completely ignore the idea that they could have been very different technologies back then. For example, some ancient Egyptian traditions tell of priests singing while the massive blocks were raised. Given the appropriate interpretation, it is therefore conceivable that the Egyptians had a sound-based technology. After all, we know that sound can fundamentally manipulate matter. Building techniques. It is above all the Egyptian pyramids that have been the focus of scientific attention for centuries. Even 2,000 years ago, people were impressed by how something like this could be built with the muscle and willpower of a people alone. So it's no wonder that the Pyramid of Cheops, for example, has always been one of the ancient wonders of the world. But the pyramids have also been described by some as a work of aliens for many decades. However, research has not remained inactive, and even if the architecture and construction of many pyramids is still a mystery to this day, it has been possible to unlock some of the secrets of the pharaoh's architecture over the course of time. While it is already certain that the construction of the pyramids was only possible with the help of incredible numbers of people, thousands of workers were working on some of the pyramids at any one time. The alignment and procurement of materials in particular remained unclear for many years. It is now certain that many of the huge stone blocks were created in the ancient Tura quarry. As it was sometimes impossible to roughly carve the stone with the tools of the time, it sometimes took months to carve a single block. Here too, the mass of people was an advantage. Thousands of stonemasons worked simultaneously to produce the required number of stone blocks. Furthermore, researchers now know that the orientation of the pyramids was by no means a coincidence. Some were aligned with the sun on holy days, while others were aligned with the night sky at the time. It is now also known that the Nile played an important role in transporting the materials. The river had a completely different course at that time and was located near the larger pyramid fields. All in all, it is still incredibly impressive to this day to see the means by which the remarkable pyramid structures were built over several decades and the very different techniques used to construct them. Greek fire. To this day, Greek fire remains a great mystery to researchers. This is not at least due to the fact that there are no confirmed finds of these weapons, and the records from antiquity are so ambiguous that it was not possible to simply reproduce this impressive weapon. Based on the current state of research, the Byzantines are said to have mounted a weapon on their ships around 670 BC, with which they could simply set fire to enemy galleys and warships. While burning oil barrels and arrows were already the norm of the art of war at this time, this weapon was regarded as something like the machine gun of the time and was to change the course of entire wars. It is said that knowledge of this weapon came to the Byzantine Empire from Egypt. There, it was kept in a state secret and ensured that the Byzantines had a decisive advantage over other peoples on the Mediterranean. It is said that the fire could simply be shot from a kind of weapon at other ships floating nearby and thus set the enemy ship on fire. While the existence of such weapons is also documented from other parts of the world, an indication that the knowledge must have spread from Byzantium, it is still not entirely clear what exactly it was made of. Theories range from a mixture of saltpeter and water to phosphates. However, it remains a great mystery how the engineers of the time were able to produce such a destructive weapon without modern methods and without something like gunpowder. Cement that doesn't crack. Rome is a city that was built to last. Some of the most impressive buildings in European history still bear witness to this today. One reason why these buildings have stood the test of time and show hardly a trace of decay lies in a secret of Roman architecture that has puzzled experts for a long time. According to some researchers, the cement used to construct many of the historic buildings is even more durable than the materials used today. The secret lies in a mixture of unique natural deposits found around Rome. Made from a mixture of volcanic ash, seawater, and other natural materials, Roman cement has one property in particular that is still impressive today. It does not crack. This meant that cement could even be used to build such impressive shapes as the dome of the Parthenon. Many researchers of the time must have thought about the building material and created the compounds that have survived to this day. The cement also still works, which makes it flexible during the construction phase and prevents it from cracking at some point due to tight statics. A true miracle that became one of the cornerstones of the Eternal City. The first seismoscope. Until well into the Middle Ages, earthquakes were perceived primarily as the wrath of the gods rather than as a logical consequence of tectonic shifts in the earth. The fear of these natural phenomena was enormous. After all, earthquakes could destroy even modern cities just like that. In China, a seismoscope was therefore developed over 2,000 years ago to observe and measure the Earth's vibrations. This enabled researchers to make their own records of earthquakes and record them in the famous chronicles of the Chinese dynasties. The mathematician and astronomer Zhang Heng developed a vessel with 8 dragon heads for the rough cardinal points and a vibration template. Based on the movements of the vessel, he was able to recognize quite accurately how strong an Earth movement was and from which direction it came. When researchers rebuilt the first seismoscope under the conditions of the time, they realized not only that it worked, but that it was amazingly accurate even compared to today's technology, and therefore gave people important information about earthquakes in the region. Automated doors. Automated doors are taken for granted in today's world, and we encounter them in everything from supermarkets to trains. But who would have thought that the ancient Greeks had already developed a system that opened and closed doors without the help of humans? In this specific case, such a system was found in a temple in Alexandria. It is said that the mathematician Heron of Alexandria developed a system that made use of the fire that burned in the temples. Together with some containers filled with water and connected to the fire, the liquid expanded after the flame was ignited, and the doors of the temple opened automatically thanks to a hydraulic system. This meant that the temple not only opened for the pilgrims in front of the door, but also presented an almost divine image. Doors that opened for the pilgrims without the influence of humans, and thus apparently by the hands of gods. According to Heron's records, the system was later used elsewhere, for example at the city gates of Alexandria. At the time, the city was considered one of the largest centers in the world and a center of attraction for scholars. Armored carriages. Since the First World War at the latest, tanks have become the norm on the world's battlefields. In the Second World War, they were even more decisive for the success or failure of the battles. However, the invention of the first armored vehicle took place many centuries before the World Wars and can be traced back to the universal genius Leonardo da Vinci. The armored car had a conical shape and was presented to his master, the Zofars, as the ultimate weapon of war. He sent them the first design proposals as early as 1487. However, the armored car was probably never actually built. Today, it is disputed among experts whether the round chariot would actually have been able to operate on the battlefield. Although it would have offered protection for the occupants, its weight would have made it too difficult to move. Replicas based on his prototypes have produced very different results. All in all, however, his designs could have made a difference due to their deterrent effects alone. However, it is unlikely that such a vehicle was actually used in the Middle Ages. Steam turbine. The Industrial Revolution is mainly due to the steam turbine. Suddenly, people's strength was no longer so important, as machines could be powered easily. In fact, the effect of steam had already been discovered in early Greece, although it was never put to productive use. The so-called Aleopile, which was also invented by Heron of Alexandria, was a small fire basin with a ball placed above it. When the water in the basin evaporated, the steam propelled the ball. However, the concept was never taken any further and therefore never developed any real practical use. This is the reason why the Industrial Revolution did not take place 2,000 years earlier. A spark plug from a long-forgotten era. A particularly curious discovery was made by an explorer on February 13, 1961, when he was digging for geodes near the Californian town of Oaxaca, and came across a geode containing an object that was identified as a champion spark plug from the 1920s. But how could that be? A spark plug in a geo that is almost 500,000 years old? This find would completely turn the history of mankind's technical development on its head, as according to previous research, spark plugs were only invented in the 19th century. Researchers therefore assume that the find from 1961 was not a geode. Rather, we are dealing here with a deposit of rock that formed naturally over decades and could be explained logically. The history of technical development therefore does not need to be rewritten. A pity, really. A portal to another dimension? Our next story takes us to Peru. More precisely, to the Sacred Valley, which lies between the towns of Urubamba and Ollantaytambo. Here, there is a mysterious site called Nupaca Huaca in Quechua. While Nupa can be translated as the ancients, Huaca means temple. The locals have great respect for the site and refer to it as a gateway to another dimension that allows the inhabitants of the spirit world to enter the human world in the morning hours. According to popular belief, these beings, known as Nuapas, are very dangerous and should therefore be left alone. Accordingly, the locals reacted critically to scientists and speleologists who set out to explore the site in the past. Among other things, the researchers discovered a stone megalithic throne inside, although its purpose remains unclear to this day. The same applies to the origins of the site itself. Boreholes that are way ahead of their time. It is now common knowledge that the ancient Egyptians were full of surprises. However, the current case surprises even experienced historians. It concerns almost perfect boreholes in rose granite, which were discovered in numerous ancient sites and could not actually have been drilled with the technology available at the time. Researchers initially assumed that the ancient Egyptians used copper or bronze pipe drills and used quartz sand as an abrasive. However, the attempt to recreate this process was a complete failure and raised more questions than it ultimately answered. How was it possible to drill such accurate holes several thousand years ago? Particularly impressive, according to historians, the discovered boreholes can be traced to the Comitians, a people who lived around 12,000 years ago and are described by experts as very advanced. Their most famous works include the Sphinx, the Great Pyramids of Giza, and of course, these boreholes. Kazakhstan. Geoglyphs amaze researchers. Kazakhstan is certainly one of the most interesting travel destinations in the former Eastern Bloc due to its exciting history and impressive nature. Another reason to visit Kazakhstan is the impressive geoglyphs that were discovered in the Turgai Steppe in the Kostani region at the beginning of the 20th century. After it was unclear for a long time where the geoglyphs came from, the Kazakh government initiated extensive research in 2007 using the Google Earth program and came across more geoglyphs in the Turgai region, which experts say are definitely of natural origin. As impressive as the formations may look, supernatural forces were not at work here. However, this should not deter tourists visiting Kazakhstan from paying a visit to the Turgai Steppe and seeing the mysterious geoglyphs, which are up to 680 meters long, for themselves. A penchant for modesty. The Pythagorean Cup. The Pythagorean Cup is an object that looks like a normal drinking vessel. As is so often the case, however, the devil is hidden in the detail. The drinking cup was fitted with a central column from which a small tube led into an additional chamber. According to unconfirmed legends, the Pythagorean cup was designed more than 2,000 years ago to teach people modesty. The design, attributed to Pythagoras, forces people to fill the cup only to a certain level. If you stick to this guideline, it is possible to drink from the cup without any problems. However, if the cup is filled beyond the specified mark and then brought to the mouth, the entire contents spill out through the tube at the bottom of the cup. This technique was intended to punish people's greed. However, the legends do not reveal to what extent the cup led to a change in thinking at the time. Exciting art from ancient Rome. The Lygoris Cup. Numerous political, technical, and cultural achievements are attributed to the ancient Romans. The fact that the Romans also had a penchant for exciting art is proved by the Lycoris cup, which, according to historians, dates back to the 4th century AD. One of the special features of the Lycoris cup is the fact that it was made of diachronic glass, which creates an exciting play of light. If the cup is illuminated from behind, it glows in the color red. If, on the other hand, it is illuminated from the front, the Lycurg beaker glows green. The play of colors is achieved by the special production of the cup, which is still a secret of the ancient Romans. Although researchers discovered that the glass was enriched with nanoparticles of gold and silver, the exact manufacturing process went down in history along with the Roman Empire several centuries ago. Vimana, the flying palaces of the Hindus. Hinduism is certainly one of the most interesting religions with its many rituals and different gods. The so-called Vimana, palaces or chariots of the gods that soar into the sky, are part of many Hindu stories. The Sanskrit word Vimana can best be translated as to measure out, to traverse, or to have been measured out. The exact origin of the legends surrounding the Vimana remains unclear to this day and is also not clear from the various historical writings of Hinduism. However, a Hindu holy scripture states that Vimana Vasin, inhabitants of Vimana, represents a class of gods who serve the Tirthamkara Mahavira. These deities in turn are known to reside in the heaven of Urdhava Loka and watch over the world and humanity from there. Incidentally, in the case described here, we are dealing with the first Vimana to be discovered in surviving Hindu scriptures. Part of a 250,000-year-old UFO? In 1973, on the banks of the Mureș River in Odd, Romania, workers discovered a lump around 20 centimeters long, 10 meters below the Earth's surface, which is still the subject of speculation and research today. Archaeologists who were commissioned to examine the aluminum came to the conclusion that it was a complex artificial metal that was definitely not of natural origin and was instead produced artificially. More detailed analyses revealed that the object was made from 12 different metals and is at least 250,000 years old. An age that puzzled the researchers, as people 250,000 years ago were far from being able to produce such a complex material. The object has concave shapes that suggest it may have been part of a more complex mechanical system. A UFO or another extraterrestrial object? We'll probably never know, unfortunately. Completely immune to rust, the Iron Pillar of Delhi. In the last article of our video, we return to India, more precisely to the Delhi metropolitan region. Here, you will find a 7.21 meter high structure with a diameter of 41 centimeters, which was erected in the time of Chandragupta II, 375 to 415 AD. The Delhi Pillar gained international fame primarily due to its complex metal composition, which gave the sculpture an impressive immunity to rust. When chemists analyzed the composition of the column, they were astounded because the anti-corrosion agents were centuries ahead of the state of the art at the time. A logical explanation could not be found even after decades of intensive research. That is why the author Eric von Däniken, who specializes in extraterrestrial topics, came to the conclusion in his book Chariots of the Gods that the construction and composition of the Delhi column was only possible with extraterrestrial help. Assumptions that are doubted by science, however. They were certainly not ordinary people. It is unbelievable that scientists keep trying to convince us that these gigantic stone blocks were cut with the simplest of tools by particularly talented people. Science provides us with alleged explanations for the cutting and carving of the largest individual stone monuments, which are perhaps only halfway acceptable. However, all attempts at explanation fail from the moment we try to explain how these stone blocks were transported. Today, we would need 10 heavy-duty cranes just to lift these enormous stone columns, but we simply don't have the machinery to transport them because all known axle vehicles on Earth would collapse under the load. Some of the huge pillars still lie in the Balak quarry in the heart of Lebanon. Others of the gigantic monoliths were built into the Temple of Jupiter less than a kilometer away. In Roman times, Baalbek was a flourishing trading metropolis, but some researchers believe that the city and the temple complex are much older. They could have been built by a much older civilization, and the Romans then built their own temples on the impressive foundations. The Romans certainly did not have the technology to move the stones because although this people was very dominant in terms of architecture and will, it is known that the Romans did not manage to move a stone obelisk captured in Egypt, which weighed far less than the stones of Baalbek. So how were these huge blocks of stone supposed to have gotten into the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter? We must even assume the abilities and technologies of a long-forgotten civilization, and instead of vehemently denying that this civilization could have existed on Earth, scientists should rather find new ways to explain how the movement of colossal blocks weighing 1,000 tons could have taken place thousands of years ago. The large foundation stones of Baalbek have been proved to weigh around 1,000 tons each, and they were built into the foundation with such precision that things could not have happened here in the normal way. Even more incredible is a stone left behind in the nearby quarry, which weighs as much as 1,650 tons. This stone, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, is further evidence of incredible engineering. The beings who created, moved, and placed the monoliths of Baalbek either had tools and technology at their disposal that we can't even dream of today, or they possessed supernatural abilities. Who created the cave system? Whoever created these caves must have also had extraordinary skills and knowledge that go far beyond what we currently know about the ancient world. The mysterious caves of Longyu in China were discovered by a rice farmer in 1992. Fascinatingly, rumors persisted around the village that an underground city was hidden beneath the rice fields. One day, a curious villager named Wu Anai drained his pond and took a look. It is incredible what an impressive and mysterious ancient structure then came to light. 24 huge caverns that had been hidden for at least 2,500 years. These underground caverns are up to 300 meters deep and so intricate and covered with enigmatic lines and symbols that they too seem out of this world. People are said to have been at work here with hammer and chisel, but it would demonstrably take hundreds of years of painstaking manual work to create these caves. And the other question is, who removed the broken stone? Whoever created the caves of Longyu not only built 24 cathedral-like rooms and artful work, but also removed tons of stone material. No piles or remains of the stones have been found anywhere in the area. The size and complexity of these caves raises uncomfortable questions. No historical text provides records of their construction or purpose. While the fine details of the carvings here clearly indicate that the walls were carved with chisels, only thousands of workers could have accomplished this. Even today, the area is sparsely populated by ordinary people. There are no signs of an early civilization that could have lived here above ground 2,500 years ago, and no other documents, although record-keeping was common in China during this period. Who lived here, and to whom was it so important to keep these magnificent underground rooms secret from the rest of the world? Strangely enough, there were legends about the place in the village, so there must have been some kind of contact at some point. But the caves of Longyu remain a silent mystery and an architectural marvel that once again challenges our imagination. The map of the Creator? Did God have a map, and did he himself carve the features of the Ural Mountains into an ancient stone? The Dashka stone is also known in Russia as the Map of the Creator, and this stone has it all. The Dashka stone was discovered in 1999 and appears to depict the Ural Mountains and an area of almost 10,000 kilometers around them, including all the canals, rivers, and dams. The stone itself is estimated to be around 120 million years old, based on the shale fossils found in it. It consists of 3 layers. One is dolomite, the other is silicon-enriched glass, and on the surface we find calcium. This in itself is not so unusual, but what is strange are the lines, which are not normal for this type of rock. So researchers came to the conclusion that the signs could be a kind of language or marking. The lines were examined several times by experts and computers, and it turned out that there is an incredible similarity to the mountains and the surrounding land. Could this be a coincidence? The discovery of the Dashka stone has led to much debate and wild speculation. Some scientists have suggested that the resemblance of the stone to the Ural Mountains could be coincidental, but this theory is widely doubted because the map is too accurate for that. Alien technology in the forest of Japan? It sounds almost too crazy to be true. Asuka, Japan is home to megalithic stone structures that appear to be spaceships, or at least technological devices. These stone-carved structures were supposedly created at a time when humans had the simplest of tools. Let us first look at the Soka Funi Ishi, a monolith covered with intricate marks and engravings. These markings, which extend across its entire surface, are so precise and complex that they beg the question of how they were created without modern tools. The level of detail and apparent intent behind these patterns suggests that these structures were used for ritual or astronomical purposes, but the exact why remains as much a mystery as the monument's design. No less impressive is the Masodu Yo Funa, a colossal granite block measuring around 10.97 meters and approximately 4.88 meters high. The sheer size of this stone is breathtaking, and even more astonishing is the fact that it was carved from a single piece of granite. How could the builders thousands of years ago create such a work of art without the aid of modern machinery or advanced tools? The precision and skill that went into these works reveal a highly developed understanding of stone carving and a flair for design that goes far beyond what we would expect from such an ancient civilization. Isho no Hoden completes the strangest stone trio on Earth. The monument leaning against a boulder weighs around 600 tons. At a height of 7 meters, it towers majestically and appears to have been precisely cut on one side, giving it an unusual appearance. Like the colossal stones of Baalbek, this monster of a stone block raises the question of how it was moved and shaped. The fact that there are no traces of chisels or picks on its surface makes the existence of this monument even more mysterious. In Asuka, we are once again faced with a riddle that cannot be solved using conventional explanations. The impossible granite boxes from Saqqara. Let's move on to Egypt. In this country, inexplicable monuments and wonders are almost the order of the day. Almost every child knows the pyramids and the riddle of the Sphinx, but a somewhat less well-known riddle are these granite blocks from the tomb of Saqqara. To be precise, these incredible 24 black boxes are located in the so-called Serapeum of Saqqara. The 24 black stone blocks made of solid Aswan granite are hidden deep in a cave system under a hill and once again present researchers with an impossible task. The age of the blocks has been dated to more than 3,300 years. Each of these boxes weighs over 100 tons, a mass that is a challenge even with today's technology. Once again, the precision with which the stones were worked is breathtaking. The smooth surfaces, the exact edges, and the perfect symmetry of the boxes even amaze today's master stonemasons. How could the ancient Egyptians, without access to modern machines or advanced tools, create such works of art? The stone blocks are not only strange because of their enigmatic design, they seem to be out of this world, and their use is still not entirely clear today. The discovery of these boxes has led to many theories. Some suspect that they were part of a temple to the Egyptian god Serapis, but this remains speculation. Did God himself build this temple? Let me tell you about a temple that must be of divine origin, not only by its spiritual significance, but also by its architectural brilliance. The Temple of Shravanabelagola in India is a structure more than 1,000 years old and an outstanding example of ornate stone carving and almost uncanny architectural skill. The temples of Shravanabelagola are known for their perfectly carved pillars, each one a masterpiece in its own right. Each pillar is crafted with such precision and detail that it exhibits absolute symmetry. These columns are not only structurally impressive, but also aesthetically pleasing. They are beautifully polished and patterned so that visitors to the temple often cannot help but touch and admire them. The entire complex exudes an air of the special, the divine. Even foreign visitors feel this breath and can readily believe that the Hindus claim that God himself created these walls with his subtlety and nobility. Off the Pacific island of Pohnpei, which belongs to Micronesia, once stood a colossal complex that would have left any observer frozen in awe. The bottom line is that Nan Madol has lost little of its original splendor to this day. After all, its mere existence testifies to the fact that the inhabitants of the past achieved architectural wonders that are simply impressive, even from a modern perspective. Basically, the site consists of 92 artificially created islands, each about the size of a football field, which together form a kind of megacity in the middle of the sea. However, the matter becomes even more astonishing when we consider how Nan Madol was built. The ruins consist of massive basalt columns covering a total area of around 80 hectares, and no mortar was used in their construction. Instead, the columns were stacked in an equally precise and elaborate manner, some reaching heights of 7 meters. Many of the stones used weighed several tons, and some of them even weighed up to 50 tons. But that's not all. Nan Madol is also located on a coral reef that was specially prepared and expanded for its construction, making it one of the few known historical cities built on the open ocean. But how do you actually accomplish such a challenging undertaking in practice? In other words, where did the material used to build Nan Madol come from? Well, the rocks used probably originated from a quarry on the island of Pohnpei, about 25 kilometers away. However, it is unclear exactly how the massive loads were transported from A to B. There are no traces of carts or evidence of the use of lifting devices. What we do know, however, is that the finished islands were connected to each other and protected from the sea by massive dikes and walls. But of course, this immediately raises the question of who was responsible for this remarkable piece of history. Well, archaeological investigations have revealed that the construction of Nan Madol began around 1180 AD and was carried out by members of the so-called Saudeleur dynasty. These rulers had probably migrated from a neighboring archipelago to establish their new center of power here. Against this backdrop, experts assume that Nan Madol was not a city in the modern sense, but rather an administrative, cultural, and religious center that welcomed only the absolute elite of the Saudeleur. And while they performed rituals, ceremonies, and burials here, the common people lived outside the city, where they had to perform labor services. Why Nan Madol raises so many questions. However, what ultimately happened to Nan Madol, and when it was abandoned and fell into ruin, remained a complete mystery for a long time. There were simply no concrete clues as to why the kingdom of the Saudeleur fell, and why they abandoned their magnificent island complex. An ancient legend tells of the dynasty being overthrown by a warrior named Isokelekal, who supposedly came from abroad, but now archaeologists believe they have finally uncovered the true reasons behind its decline. According to this, however, it was not enemy soldiers, but nature that brought Nan Madol and its inhabitants to their knees. Scientists analyzed numerous pieces of coral and charcoal samples from the complex and also reconstructed the former climate in the region. The analysis revealed that the monumental complex was built in 2 phases and that the sea level rose significantly during this time. More precisely, it rose by about half a meter during the construction and use of Nan Madol, which led to increasingly frequent flooding and increased silting. As a result, the damaged embankments around the site probably had to be repaired or replaced on a regular basis. The inhabitants therefore had to invest more and more effort to protect their settlements, but in the end, the day came when they admitted defeat to nature, moved to other regions, and reorganized their society. So far, so insightful. But does this new approach mean that the mystery of Nan Madol has finally been solved? Well, not quite. On the one hand, we must not forget that this is only an interpretation by archaeologists. And on the other hand, this is by no means the only mystery surrounding the site. As mentioned above, there is still the question of how the massive basalt blocks were transported. In fact, there were no pack animals or wheel technology on Pohnpei, and the blocks, which weighed tons, had to be transported through dense jungle and then, of course, across the sea. In the absence of clear archaeological evidence, however, we simply cannot say what techniques the builders of Nan Madol used to achieve this. Some theories are based on the idea that the stones were transported on bamboo rafts. Others suggest the use of rollers and primitive lifting devices. Unfortunately, however, and this is the crucial point, None of the suspected methods had yet been able to successfully replicate the realistic transport of blocks weighing 50 tons. And what is the story behind this, well, somewhat unusual location? Why was Nan Madol built on the sea of all places? Creating a center of power on a coral reef was extremely costly. After all, the foundations had to be stabilized underwater. So are we dealing with a purely symbolic choice of location? Or did it serve as a deliberate demarcation? And could it be possible, at the end of the day, that there is a grain of truth in the story of Quetzalcoatl? Some experts believe that the legendary conqueror really existed and may have been an outsider tribal leader. Others, however, consider it more likely that he was a purely mythological figure, and he would not be the only one associated with Nan Madol. Exciting legends and bizarre alternative theories. The people of Pohnpei have preserved many stories and legends about Nan Madol. The best known of these tells of the twin brothers of Olosofa and Olasifa, who descended from heaven to earth to found a religious capital. The duo moved the gigantic basalt blocks with miraculous magic, and after Olosipa died, Olosofa was worshipped as a god and became the first ruler of the Saudeleur. This raises the question of how we should classify such myths. Most of us probably see them as nothing more than an imaginative fairy tale that, to put it mildly, have little in common with historical reality. However, in the alternative camp, or more precisely among the ranks of pre-astronautic enthusiasts, there are people who actually take such traditions at face value. However, the supposed celestial beings were not gods in the religious sense, but actual aliens who regularly visited the inhabitants of the past and had a significant influence on their development. At the end of the day, everyone must decide for themselves how to evaluate this astonishing belief. And yet, it is undisputed that Nan Madol is still surrounded by a mythical aura. To this day, many locals avoid the site at night, and there are rumors of evil curses and the spirits of Saudeleur. Some fishermen even claim to have seen strange lights in the ruins, while others report sudden storms or a sudden loss of orientation near the complex. Apart from aliens and sinister forces, however, there are several other alternative theories about Nan Madol. Some authors speculate that the site was built using technologies that were generations ahead of their time. However, the alleged evidence of electromagnetic anomalies and the discovery of mysterious metals have never been scientifically confirmed. The same applies, of course, to the theory that Nan Madol is connected to Plato's Atlantis myth. According to this theory, the location in the ocean, the monumental construction, and the sudden demise are said to bear clear similarities to the ancient Greek narrative that cannot be dismissed. However, even if we disregard the fact that the Atlantis story is mostly dismissed as pure fiction, this theory also has a temporal problem. While Plato described the mythical island kingdom in the middle of the 4th century BC, Nan Madol, to the best of our knowledge, was not built until the 12th century AD. But regardless of whether it is a myth, magic, or a purely human feat, Nan Madol is and remains one of the most fascinating mysteries in history. A gigantic, artificially created city in the middle of the sea, the origins of which we still do not fully understand. And perhaps the greatest insight Nan Madol provides us with is the reminder of how much we still have to learn about the past. Some of the terms are almost too much for the average person to grasp. After all, what exactly is a dolmen? Well, if you just shrug your shoulders, we'll be happy to play the dolmen translator for you. By definition, we are dealing here with a structure made of large stone blocks, consisting of at least 3 upright supporting stones and covered by 1 or more stone slabs. So far, so stony. But what purpose did the structures serve, which, incidentally, we find not only in Europe, but also in northern Africa and in parts of Asia? In this regard, experts point out that we are dealing here with millennia-old burial structures. However, if we compare the individual examples with each other, we quickly realize that not all dolmens are the same. The dolmens of the Caucasus differ greatly from their counterparts in the rest of the world. Not only are they much more precisely crafted than other counterparts, but they are also not surrounded by mounds of earth and are closed at the front. And while the unusual dolmens in the west of the mighty mountain range, more precisely in the southern Russia, Georgia, and the Abkhazia region, cover an area of around 12,000 square kilometers, it is their round holes that really catch our eye. Most researchers assume that these so-called soul holes are openings that allow the souls of the dead to enter and leave the site. However, this is only an established but purely theoretical assumption. In fact, there are no archaeological finds that clearly prove that burials were actually carried out in the Caucasus dolmens. What we do have, however, are mortal remains that have come to light in the vicinity of the dolmens, but skeptics point out that we don't know whether these were buried there much later. But at least the ceramic fragments recovered in the area seem to provide us with at least some indication of the age of the stone buildings. Their analysis showed that they were made between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. And if we now go back to the soul holes, we see that the afterlife portals are by no means always circular, but sometimes square, and that they were often provided with stone plugs to close the gate at the front. But even aside from that, the design of the Caucasus dolmens leaves us open-mouthed. For example, the massive blocks were provided with exact 90-degree angles in places so that they could be used as cornerstones. Elsewhere, the stones were bent to create a circle when connected. Added to this is the fact that the stones are arranged in an amazingly regular pattern, and that their surfaces have been perfectly smoothed. All in all, the Caucasus dolmens represent nothing less than a unique type of prehistoric architecture. Proof of a lost technology? In front of the dolmens, there is usually a courtyard, which, according to experts, was used to hold sacred rituals and ceremonies. And while this courtyard is usually surrounded by large stone walls, sometimes over a meter high, Bronze Age and Iron Age pottery, human remains, bronze tools, and precious gold and silver jewelry have been found in this area. And the fact that the dolmens were apparently very popular in the corresponding epochs is proven by the fact that 3,000 of these megalithic monuments have already been discovered in the Western Caucasus, and that the number of new discoveries is constantly growing. However, it is in the nature of things that the construction of the dolmens was, to put it mildly, quite challenging. After all, each of these structures weighs an average of 15 to 30 tons. This makes it all the more confusing that there is not the slightest trace of a quarry in the region. What's more, around the dolmens, scientists did not even find any evidence that the massive stones were somehow dragged to their intended location. And where there are no clear traces of transport, the way is open for theories of a somewhat different kind. Because in fact, the idea that the blocks, each weighing tons, were moved from A to B using only pure muscle power, and then also shaped into such amazing forms, seems, to put it mildly, questionable for alternative historians. Instead, according to the not entirely uncontroversial assumption, the Caucasus dolmens, with their smooth surfaces and circular holes, would testify that their creators were in possession of far more advanced technologies, and that was already the case 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. How you view this unorthodox interpretation is up to you, but the actual construction of the structures seems extraordinary. In most dolmens, the huge stone slabs are connected to each other by specifically crafted grooves, and often so precisely that you couldn't even slide a sheet of paper between the chunks. But how is that even possible? How did the people, thousands of years ago, with the simple means of their time, manage to create such complex stone structures? Well, a team of researchers wanted to find out exactly that in 2007, which is why they decided to reconstruct a copy of the destroyed structures in the Russian city of Gelendzhik. And although the experts were able to use the original ancient parts, they ultimately did not succeed in achieving the same precision as their prehistoric models. Who built the dolmens? But who were these prehistoric role models actually? In other words, which culture was already so advanced at the time that it could create these stone puzzles for posterity? Well, finding the answer to this question is anything but easy. In fact, archaeologist Vladimir Markovin, who has been studying the structures for years, points out that during the assumed period of their creation, people actually still lived in simple mud huts and didn't even know iron or the potter's wheel. And while they spent their days tilling the land with simple hoes, they were still able to erect structures that are extremely impressive by today's standards. However, we must not forget one thing at this point. The corresponding dating to the period between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago is only one of several approaches. Other experts consider it more likely that the artifacts recovered around the dolmens were only placed there much later, and therefore believe that the structures could even be up to 25,000 years old. However, the roots of the Klin Yar community and the Koban culture do not go back 25,000 years. And yet it is these two groups, once based in the Caucasus, that are often associated with the dolmens. However, since this is once again merely an unproven historical assumption, the imagination of alternative theories continues to know no bounds. Researchers with a penchant for the esoteric, who don't have much of an understanding of grave interpretation, believe, for example, that the stone structures mark special power places with strong energy fields. These ominous forces are even said to be able to cure serious illness and unleash our hidden abilities. And even today, pilgrims still travel to the Caucasus dolmens to make contact with unseen powers. Of course, the pre-astronautics community is also throwing its hat into the discussion ring. As is well known, the followers of this parascientific movement are firmly convinced that the inhabitants of ancient times were regularly visited by aliens. Worshipped as wondrous gods by our ancestors, the extraterrestrial guests helped people in return to build structures such as the pyramids, Stonehenge, or even the Caucasus dolmens. But there is another, no less surprising, but rather different explanation. Ask the locals about the history of the dolmens and you are likely to hear the story of the dwarves. These cute creatures are said to have once lived in the area. They were so tiny that they could even ride on hares, and they lived side by side with the giants who kindly built stone dwellings for their diminutive neighbors. But the dwarves had a way all their own of thanking their gigantic house builders. Since they had no desire to return the giants' help, they simply decided to blind them and force mind-altering herbs down their throats. The intoxicated giants then completely lost their minds and began to wipe out first the dwarves and then themselves. All that remained were the dwarf dwellings, which we know today as dolmens, and a fairy tale, if not entirely plausible, explanation for the existence of the mysterious stone structures. But we'll explain to you all the more convincingly how you'll never miss a new video from us again. Feel free to click the thumbs up and subscribe now, and stay up to date with the latest news from us from now on. See you soon!